Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to today's edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a pleasure to be with you today on this, the 22nd day of April. It is, weather here is a little bit rainy, off and on rain. Not a bad day, not very cold. Compared to what we've had, I've got to tell a little story at the beginning because I thought it was really cool. I had a doctor's appointment this morning, and while I was in the doctor's office with his nurse, she was taking blood and blood pressure and those kinds of things. We looked out the window, and the white flowers from either a cherry or a pear tree in the yard were blowing off in the wind, and it looked like snow. And she looked out there and she said, "Oh my God, it can't be." And I said, "No, it's not." No, it's not. But I guess we're so tuned in to seeing it snow that anything's possible in this year, it seems. It is a pleasure to be with you today, seriously. We welcome you to the Virtual Center. We welcome you to the Head On Radio Network, and we thank you for your willingness to give us some of your valuable time. We hope that we can reward you with programming that is not only interesting, but more important than that, meaningful and beneficial, something that you can take from your willingness to commit a block of valuable time. And we know in today's world, time is probably the most valuable thing all of us have. And the fact that you are willing to give us a portion of it, of your time, we take very, very seriously and appreciate very, very much. So at the beginning, before we even begin today, thank you so very, very much. I was struck when I was listening to Bob's intro of the program about the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. And I was thinking about today's program, which is pretty much a continuation of yesterday's program. And what flashed through my mind is what we're looking at, in a sense, is pretty much uncivic responsibility, in that we're looking at the manipulation of the record, of history, in order to fit a particular agenda. And I really do believe that it is very, very serious stuff. And, I thank you for being with us. I hope that I can make your time with us meaningful and beneficial to you. If you'd like to call us, we'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your concerns and considerations and suggestions about this material. We do have a phone number. It's primarily there just for your benefit. The number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me on some of these issues, by all means, I'd love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Going back to yesterday's program a little bit as a way to lead into today's, we spent most of our time talking about the idea, the prospects that are looming in America today of a second constitutional convention. I say this because, as we discussed yesterday, Michigan became the 34th state, which is the two-thirds, to request a constitutional amendment, constitutional convention for consideration of an amendment to mandate or require a balanced budget on the federal government. So it would be a balanced budget amendment. And then we looked at an article written on the 9th of April by George Will, in which he was looking at the Goldwater Institute's Compact for America proposed amendment, balanced budget amendment. And of course the whole idea was that, and George Will makes very clear in the language of the article, that the purpose of this is to is to basically make it escape-free, so that there really would be no way around maintaining a balanced budget and adhering to the requirements of the law once this amendment was passed. And of course that assumes not only that it has gained the 2/3 of the states for the call of the convention, but that the amendment is approved by 3/4 of the states, either 3/4 of the state legislature or by special conventions called in 3/4 of the states. I would make a prediction. This is not a very risky one, but given the fact that there are two options here, once an amendment has been approved for submission to the states, it requires 3/4. And according to the Article 5 of the Constitution, it must be approved by 3/4 of the states, either through their state legislatures or in special conventions in 3/4 of the states. I would be pretty safe, I think, in assuming that we're not going to see the calling of special conventions in all the states in order to approve such an amendment. I would suggest, given the control of the legislatures and the gerrymandering of electoral districts that has made this whole happening possible, my suggestion is that for those who are pushing hardest for this kind of an amendment, for a convention and for this kind of an amendment, the legislature, 3/4 of the legislatures, would probably be the most efficient and effective route. So I doubt very much whether they would go through the process of calling conventions and getting approval in 3/4 of the states through conventions. I think that they would probably rely on their ability to control state legislatures. And the fact of the matter is, it's important to recognize that a balanced budget amendment is not an agenda item only of the extreme right, only of the wingnuts, as the term that is frequently used. The balanced budget amendment is supported by a lot of people, including Democrats, and it's a very popular amendment. So the real issue, however, I would suggest, is not the balanced budget amendment. Of course, is significant in itself. But I would suggest to you more significant than that is the second convention at which a balanced budget amendment would be brought up. Because the issue is whether in fact it's possible to contain a second convention. The founders believed that it was not. The founders believed that the most dangerous thing to ratification of the Constitution itself would be a second convention in order to consider amendments. And we're going to deal with that today because I do want to deal in depth with Hamilton's 85th Federalist paper, which addresses the issue of the second convention directly. I think it's a very revealing paper. I think it says a lot, and it also applies directly to the issues that we've been considering. So what I'd like to do today is I'd like to look at Hamilton's 85th Federalist paper, and look at some of the arguments that he makes regarding the idea of a second convention and the idea of amendments generally, Article 5. And then I'd like to turn back to the whole issue of the calling of the convention itself. And specifically, I'd like to take us from there into the whole philosophical difference, the ideological differences, the most heated differences, if you will, between the extremes of right and left today, in terms of the Constitution and the power and the role of government and the whole issue of rights and all the rest of it. I really believe, and I've been doing a lot of reading and a lot of research over the last 4 or 5 days on this issue. I really believe that I've got some pretty good information. I really, really do believe that by the time we finish we complete consideration of these issues, I think listeners, we're all going to be pretty clear on exactly what the major differences are today, what the threat is to our constitutional system. I made reference yesterday to the fact that these people in support of a second convention are really out to destroy the republic as the founders envisioned it and created it. I do believe that. I do believe that the reason that if there was a second convention called, if indeed this does happen, and Federalist 85 addresses this as well, if indeed a second convention does happen, whether in fact its order of business can be restricted to the consideration of a specific amendment, and specifically we're talking here about the balanced budget amendment, I really think that they will probably we'll end up seeing a split, if you will, between those people that will be satisfied with a balanced budget amendment and those who want to take the issue much further. Once they have a second constitutional convention convened, even though it is comprised principally of the governors, this is the plan that the Goldwater Institute has put forth, that the representatives of the states at a second convention would be the governors of those states. There's going to be a significant element within the right, once the second convention is a reality, to break free of whatever limitations, whatever compact restrictions there are. And looming in the background are the Freedom Amendments, the book that we looked at several months ago by Mark Levin. Because I think that's the real agenda, the total emasculation of the power of the federal government in an effort to return power to the states. I think that's the issue. I think that's what these folks are about. And if they all seem to be coming together around or in support of a balanced budget amendment, I think that's because the balanced budget amendment is so popular that it's probably not going to raise flags. In other words, this whole movement is extremely surreptitious. It's well planned. It's duplicitous. The fact that the media, the national media, has not really even touched this yet, I think says an awful lot. These people are laying low, and this whole movement is building and building, and once it becomes visible to the majority of the American people, I think that's when the attention is going to be focused upon it. And I think until that point, I think the idea is, as far as keeping all the forces together, keeping everybody in line, so to speak, then focusing on the balanced budget amendment as the objective of the second convention is really good politics. It's a political decision. Clearly, those who are pushing hardest for a second convention do not want a national debate on the pros and cons of a second convention. What they want is what they may have indeed gotten, which is the 34th state to request a convention to approve a balanced budget amendment. What they want is the second convention. And there's been very little publicity about that, because the focus is on the balanced budget amendment, not the reality of the convention itself. Once the convention is a reality, however, I think we're going to see the ambitions and the implications of this expand, and the heat is going to be turned up to an incredible degree. I think at that point we're going to see the forces in support of this splitting between those who want to use the vehicle of the second convention to make substantive changes in the constitutional system of the United States to the point that the power of the federal government is effectively emasculated, as opposed to those who would be satisfied, at least for the time being, with a balanced budget amendment, assuming that that would probably get rid of the things that they are most concerned about in terms of the power and overspending of the federal government. I really think, however, that it is incumbent upon progressives to get on this and to basically shine the light of day on it. I think doing this in secret, in relative secrecy, is a strategy. I think it ought to be exposed. I think the more light we can bring to this whole movement, who's behind it, what's the intent. The issue is not the balanced budget amendment. The issue is the second convention. That's very clearly what the Levins and those folks and the Tea Party folks and all the rest of it have been advocating from the very beginning. That point has to be made very clear. Because, again, there are many people that will not shy away from a national debate on the pros and cons of a balanced budget amendment. That is not the issue. The issue is the convention. And I think today, with the materials that I've been able to pull together, I really think we're going to see exactly how the founders would react to this. I think we're going to see how the founders felt about amendments, about changing the Constitution, and about the whole issue of a second convention. So with that, let me again repeat the phone number and invite you to participate and call in and express yourself, and the more dialogue we can get going here. Please don't assume that I've got a track record here and I'm on some clock where I have to get all of this information in a certain amount of time. That's not it at all. I'm assuming that we have 6 hours a week of program time available to us, and as much as we need as we move from week to week to week, we'll take it. Because I think the end is driving the program here, what we're about. This is a Center for the Study of the Constitution and the study of civic responsibility. I think the two are connected, and I'll be very honest with you. I think the civic responsibility part of this whole equation is in jeopardy right now with the second convention. I think that's what this is about. And I think the nature of civic responsibility and civic involvement and civic participation in our political system will undergo revolutionary change unless attention is not brought to the kinds of things that are going on. So again, let me give you the phone number. It is area code 304-658-3333. 304-658-3333. Let me begin by looking at Hamilton's Federalist paper number 85. And it is the last Federalist paper. In fact, it is entitled Concluding Remarks, because this appeared in the New York newspapers. It appeared specifically in the Independent Journal in New York on Wednesday, the 13th of August, and Saturday, the 16th of August, 1788. Let's go back. You may remember that the Federalist Papers began to appear in the New York newspapers after the closing of the Constitutional Convention in September of 1787. Now we're looking at August 13 and 16, 1788. What we're looking at then is 85 papers, 85 Federalist papers that appeared in the New York newspapers over the course of almost a full year, 11 months, from October of 1787 until August of 1788. And this is the last one. And again, they are in New York. They are aimed primarily at the people of the state of New York. But as you know, other newspapers in other states began to pick up and publish these Federalist papers as they appeared. So what you find is that as the publications go on from the first few of the Federalist papers, once you get beyond the first few, you begin to notice that Philadelphia papers and Boston papers and Baltimore papers and Alexandria, Virginia papers and are picking up these papers. And once, because of the depth and the substance that they contain, once a newspaper begins to publish them, it doesn't let go. It publishes all of them from that point on. So consequently, the whole nation is reading these papers. So even though they are addressed to the people of the state of New York, in effect, They are written to the people of the United States of America, to all the people of the 13 independent states under the Confederation. So again, this appears in the Independent Journal on Wednesday, August 13th, and it is finished on August 16th, 1788. Obviously, if you go to the library and you can go back and pull up these papers, and indeed you can do that. You will find this Federalist paper on the first page, on the front page. This is front page stuff. Okay. Hamilton sets out in Federalist number 85, in what he entitles Concluding Remarks, to basically summarize what he believes he's accomplished, what Publius believes that he has accomplished. And remember, Publius includes Hamilton, but it also includes Madison and John Jay. All of the papers signed Publius. But this is an effort. Hamilton writes most of them, and understandably, given the fact that Jay and Hamilton are both New York politicians. So it stands to reason that the bulk of the papers would be written by those two men. Hamilton sets out to talk about the objectives, and he believes that the objectives that were what the Federalist Papers were all about have been achieved. And he says at the very beginning of the thing, at the very beginning of number 85, there still remain for discussion 2 points that we haven't yet raised specifically. We haven't really addressed these points directly. The first one is the analogy of the proposed government to our own state constitution. In other words, so far, what the Federalist Papers have not done is suggest ways in which the proposed Constitution of the United States mirrors in many ways the Constitution of the state of New York. They are very similar. And Hamilton says that's one point that it would seem that we probably should address. The second point that he feels remains to be addressed is, quote, the additional security which its adoption, the Constitution's adoption, will afford to Republican government, to liberty, and to property. So again, what Hamilton is proposing here is the fact that there are 2 pieces of business left undone, left unfinished. The first one is to clarify the analogy between the new Constitution, proposed Constitution, and the state constitution in New York. And the second thing is to lay out clearly for readers the additional security which ratification of the Constitution will bring to Republican government, to liberty, and to property in America. But then he says, these heads have been so fully anticipated, and throughout the course of the Federalist Papers, we've exhausted these things to the point that now we've reached the point where, as he says, it would be scarcely possible to do anything more than repeat in a more dilated form what's already been said, what has been heretofore said. In other words, even though these things haven't been addressed directly, the fact of the matter is they've been addressed indirectly. And to raise these issues now, he says, would merely require that we repeat things we've already said. So therefore, obviously, he's saying we don't need to do this. But then, in the second paragraph, he does address an issue that needs to be addressed. He said, and what I want to do, first of all, I marked this sentence, the very first sentence of the second paragraph. I want you to listen to this. And I want you to, in the back of your mind, think of the word doublespeak. Notice how this is written and how difficult it is to understand. It's yet one more example in the very last paper of the level on which the Federalist Papers are written. They are not written to inform the common people. They are written to confuse the common people. They are written to enlighten the few. And I think that will become clear with this sentence. It is remarkable that the resemblance of the plan of the convention to the act which organizes the government of this state holds, not less with regard to many of the supposed defects than to the real excellences of the former. I'll even go so far as to read that sentence again, because it's not that long. It is remarkable that the resemblance of the plan of the convention to the act which organizes the government of this state holds, not less with regard to many of the supposed defects than to the real excellence of the former. If you put that on an SAT test for high school graduates wanting to go to college and ask them what that meant, what do you think? What kind of answers do you think you'd get? It uses the passive voice. More effectively, it uses latter and former, and latter, and it forces the reader to go back and forth in order to clarify exactly what this and that refers to. Most people who don't read well are not going to do that, which means that this has no meaning at all to the average reader. In fact, if you read the first sentence of a paragraph and you can't figure out what it says, chances are you're probably going to scrap the whole document, the rest of it. Chances are. And then he talks about what he calls the pretended defects of the Constitution. In other words, what he's talking about is that that many people are making a big thing about over the defects in the Constitution. But the fact of the matter is, the same kinds of defects are existent in our own state constitution, and he brings that point home again later. But then he lists the major defects that are pointed out about the Constitution. Among the pretended defects, notice the use of vocabulary here. In other words, what he's suggesting here is they really aren't defects. They're pretended defects because they're being put forth by people who don't want the Constitution ratified. So they're looking for flaws. And among the things they emphasize are the following: the re-eligibility of the executive. In other words, one of the things that they're concerned about is the fact that the president can be reelected. They don't like that. They see too much of the idea of a king there. The second thing that they find a defect in is the want of a council, an advisory council, an executive council. What they're talking about is those people in the nation who have the most wisdom and can be the real advisors to the president. In other words, the power, the intellectual and economic power of the nation in an advisory role, kind of like the Privy Council to the king in England. The third pretended defect, the omission of a formal Bill of Rights. This becomes the big one, because this is the absence of a Bill of Rights, more than anything else, becomes the thing that looks like it might bring a second convention, and that's the last thing they want. So the omission of a formal Bill of Rights. And the fourth pretended defect, the omission of a provision respecting the liberty of the press. Notice that Hamilton distinguishes liberty of the press from the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights that's going to be added to the Constitution after it's ratified is going to include freedom of the press in the First Amendment. But Hamilton is not considering liberty of the press and Bill of Rights in the same context here. That could be significant, I don't know. Then he said, these and several others which have been noted in the course of our inquiries are as much chargeable on the existing Constitution of this state as on the one proposed for the Union. In other words, what he's pointing out is the very same defects that people are screaming about against the Constitution exist in our own state constitution as well, and nobody's screaming about that. He said, a man must have slender pretensions to consistency, who can rail at the latter for imperfections, which he finds no difficulty in excusing in the former. And what he's pointing out is these people have a political agenda. They're just looking for excuses to try to point out flaws in the Constitution, when in fact many of the flaws that they're pointing out exist in the state constitutions as well, and nobody's railing about those. So that, if you remember in the first paragraph, he said two things to be addressed. The first one would be a comparison between the proposed Constitution and our state constitution. Now he's done that, and basically what he's pointed out is the major defects that people see in the Constitution exist in our state constitution as well. So that pretty much closes the book on that issue. And then he addresses the second one, and if you remember, the second one was the additional security which ratification would bring to Republican government, to liberty, and to property. And he addresses that in the third paragraph. And he says the following: the additional securities to Republican government, to liberty, and to property to be derived from the adoption of the plan under consideration consist chiefly in the restraints which the preservation of the Union will impose on local factions and insurrections, and on the ambition of powerful individuals in single states who may acquire credit and influence enough from leaders and favorites to become the despots of the people. One of the things he's suggesting is that ratification of the Constitution will apply a major restraint on those local factions and insurrections and those powerful individuals within states whose influence and power and wealth give them the potential to become despots of the people. Once we have this Constitution, we won't have to worry about them anymore. The reason I'm emphasizing this today is because I would suggest to you that very surreptitiously we are looking at the potential for exactly this. The ambition of powerful individuals in states who are looking to sink this republic. And they're using the unpopularity of the federal government, the fact that we're operating at a deficit, everything that they can get their hands on to attack the president. I won't even get into the fact that the president is not a Caucasian. That, of course, is another issue that they very surreptitiously use in code, but they don't direct it. They don't address it directly, obviously. But here are some of the things that the ratification of the Constitution will preserve the Union by protecting it from the following: from local factions and insurrection, and from the ambition of powerful individuals in single states who may acquire credit and influence enough from leaders and favorites to become despots of the people. Here's a second threat that the Constitution will address: the diminution of the opportunities to foreign intrigue. Once the Constitution is established, we're not going to have individuals within states cutting deals and making secret agreements with people in other countries, foreign intrigue, which the dissolution of the Confederacy would invite and facilitate. In other words, his argument is once the Articles of Confederation continues to deteriorate, more and more we're going to face foreign intrigue. The Constitution will take care of that. Next, the prevention of extensive military establishments. This is critical. The extensive military establishments which could not fail to grow out of wars between the states in a disunited situation. What he's pointing out is, if we don't create a union, if we don't ratify this Constitution, we're looking at the potential for war between the states. Obviously, we did end up having war between the states, as we know. What Hamilton is suggesting here is the degree of disagreement and discord that exists between the states. And if we don't find some way to get control of it and check it, then ultimately we're going to face states building up their own military power in order to threaten other states. We can't have that. There's another issue that this particular point raises in terms of our overall program today. We're pointing toward the idea of a second convention. And the idea of calling the second convention on the part of the Tea Party folks and those who are pushing hardest for it, including George Will, is to return power to the states from an overbearing, overpowering central government. That's the position they claim. And their argument is that what they are trying to do is suggest that the founders would not have supported a strong federal government like we have today. That the founders were very supportive and respective of state power. The fact of the matter is, this point right here in Hamilton's 85th paper is proof that Hamilton believed that the states couldn't get along at all. That there was every likelihood they'd end up going to war against each other if we didn't create a union. To me, it seems to make common sense that nowhere in Hamilton's frame of reference, in his vision, would he ever believe that two-thirds of the states could get together to amend the Constitution by calling a constitutional convention. Hamilton didn't believe that the states agreed on enough to make that even a remote possibility. So what I'm suggesting is that those people today who are trying to use the founders to justify the calling of a second convention are playing fast and loose with the historical facts. The founders want of the Constitution to take power away from the states. They had it all under the Articles of Confederation. No way did they want to preserve power in the states over the federal government. The purpose of the Constitution was to end that. We have to keep that in mind. And finally, in the express guarantee of a Republican form of government, there is a phrase in Article 4 of the Constitution where the Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government to each state. Next, the absolute universal exclusion of titles of nobility. That's out if the Constitution is ratified. And in the precautions against the repetition of those practices on the part of state governments which have undermined the foundations of property and credit, have planted mutual distrust in the breasts of all classes of citizens, and have occasioned an almost universal prostration of morals. This last one, this is what the Constitution is going to fix. It's going to fix a situation in this country where within state governments, state power has undermined the foundations of property and credit. Who has the property? Who are the creditors? Who's pushing hardest for the Constitution? In other words, what the Constitution is going to do is come to the rescue of the most considerate and virtuous citizens. That's James Madison's term from Federalist Number 10. The best people, the creditors, the property owners. It's going to come to their rescue because with the inclusion of things like the contract clause in the Constitution, No longer are states going to be able to manipulate the value of money, the availability of credit. No longer are states going to be able, through the legislature, to interfere in private contract obligations between debtor and creditor, between renters and property owners, and all the rest of it. These are the people who want the Constitution because of the stability and the security that it promises. And what Hamilton is saying is all of these things will be secured with ratification of the Constitution. No longer will what Madison called, in his Vices of the American Political System, if you remember, the 11 major flaws in the Articles of Confederation that that Madison pointed out prior to the Constitutional Convention. All of them happening within states that were over which there was no control. Now there will be control, and those problems will be wrested. This is what the founders were after. This is what ratification of the Constitution is about. So all of this stuff about a second convention and a runaway federal government and all the rest of it, and the founders would support the calling of a second convention, is bogus. Thus, Hamilton says, fellow citizens, I have executed the task I had assigned to myself. With what success, your conduct must determine. In other words, I did it. That's what the Federalist Papers were able to do. I did it. Now the ball's in your court, is what Hamilton is saying. One of the things he points to is the allegation of anti-federalists, the charges of those opposed to the Constitution, that there really is a conspiracy against the liberties of the people. And the reason I'm mentioning this is in his next paragraph, is because of one sentence in there that I want to read to you, because I think it says an awful lot. The perpetual changes which have been wrung upon the wealthy, the well-born, and the great have been such as to inspire the disgust of all sensible men. What Hamilton is saying in Federalist 85, is that ratification of the Constitution will end once and for all the perpetual changes which have been wrung upon the wealthy, the well-born, and the great. Changes which have been such as to inspire the disgust of all sensible men. He goes on. The unwarrantable concealments and misrepresentations which have been in various ways practiced to keep the truth from the public eye. In other words, he's making the case in this last paper that you've got to ratify this thing. It would be insane not to ratify this thing. Hamilton's making the point. He says, now let us pause and ask ourselves whether in the course of these papers the proposed Constitution has not been satisfactorily vindicated from the aspersions thrown upon it. And what he's doing is basically making his argument here that I think if you look at what we said through these 85 papers, that we pretty well took down all the criticisms that you're hearing about this system. Hamilton says, I am persuaded that it is the best which our political situation, habits, and opinions will admit, and superior to any the Revolution has produced. What he's basically saying is, of course there are flaws in it. Of course it's not perfect. But the fact of the matter is, I am persuaded that it's the best that our political situation, our habits, and our opinions will admit, and it's superior to any that the Revolution has produced. And then he addresses the issue of flaws. And he says, concessions on the part of the friends of this plan, that it is not that it has not a claim to absolute perfection, have afforded matter of no small triumph to its enemies. In other words, once we have admitted that it ain't perfect, then people are saying, why, this is a quote, why, they say, should we adopt an imperfect thing? Why not amend it and make it perfect before it is irrevocably established? In other words, if it's not perfect, and we know it's not perfect, why don't we fix it before we put it on the road, before we ratify it? The rest of this paper, 85, is going to be Hamilton's effort to argue that we need to ratify first, then amend it later. And he's going to tell us why. And that why addresses the issue of the danger of a second convention. He says the critics have stated, they have been stated as amounting to an admission. In other words, once we admit that it's not perfect, then they exaggerate our concessions. They've been stated as amounting to an admission that the plan is radically defective, and that without material alteration, the rights and interests of the community cannot be safely confided to it. Hamilton says this is an entire perversion of their sense. The reason that we admit that it's not perfect is because man's not perfect. But what we need to do is put it in operation, and then experience will tell us where it needs to be fixed. He said, though it may not be perfect in every part, it is, upon the whole, a good plan. And then he said, I answer in the next place that I should esteem it the extreme of imprudence to prolong the precarious state of our national affairs, and to expose the Union to the jeopardy of successive experiments. I never expect to see a perfect work from imperfect man, he said. Then he points out how difficult it is to come up with a plan that all 13 states potentially can agree on. He points out that there are all of these compromises necessary. There are all of these different interests and inclinations. How can perfection spring from this, he says. Now he addresses the issue of the Second Convention. And that is the utter improbability of a second convention. And he's pointing out the arguments that are already out there as to why we do not need or should not have a second convention. And basically what he says is there are no circumstances that are going to allow us to come out of a second convention in as happy a state as we did out of the previous convention. I'm not going to repeat all the arguments used there, he said, but there is, however, one point of light on which the subject of amendments still remains to be considered. And here it is. It will be far easier to obtain subsequent than previous amendments to the Constitution. The moment, and here's his answer, the moment an alteration is made in the present plan, it becomes, the whole plan becomes, to the purpose of adoption, a new one, and must undergo a new decision of each state. In other words, if we try to amend it before we approve it, before we ratify it, then every single change we make means we've got to go back to all the states and get their approval again. We'll never get it. To its complete establishment throughout the Union, it will therefore require the concurrence of all 13 states. On the contrary, if the proposed Constitution is ratified and put into operation, then, according to Article 5, alterations can be effected by 9 states. Here, then, the chances are as 13-9 in favor of subsequent amendment rather than of the original adoption of an entire system. What he's saying is if we try to amend it before we ratify the Constitution, we're going to need 13 states to agree to the change. Once the system's in operation, all we need is 9 to amend it. So that, he feels, is a major reason why we should approve it and then amend it rather than amend it first. But then he said, this is not all. Every constitution for the United States inevitably must consist of a great variety of particulars, he says. We may, of course, expect to see in any body of men charged with its original formation different combination of the parts upon different points. In other words, he's talking about the diversity and how impossible it would be to get agreement. Many of those who form a majority on one question may become the majority on a second question, and an association dissimilar to either may constitute the majority on a third. In other words, there are so many disagreements, so many points of discord, that previous amendments to ratification would be impossible. He says the degree of that multiplication must evidently be in a ratio to the number of particulars and the number of parties. In other words, when you take the number of changes, the number of interests, the number of people, the number of particulars, and the number of different parties, groups of people who want different things, you're talking about ratios. How in heaven's name are you going to get agreement, is what he says. But here's his answer. Every amendment to the Constitution, if once established, in other words, once the Constitution is ratified, every amendment would be a single proposition and might be brought forward singly. There would then be no necessity for management or compromise in relation to any other point, no giving or taking. The will of the requisite number would at once bring the matter to a decisive issue. In other words, once you ratify the Constitution, then when you amend it, it's going to be a single proposition, a single change. It's not going to require management. It's not going to require compromise. It's going to be, there it is. You either approve it or you disapprove it. Let me make one point here. When Hamilton says this about every amendment once the Constitution is ratified would be a single proposition, he's clearly assuming that the only amendment procedure that would be available would be amendments approved by 2/3 of Congress and sent out to the states for ratification. He's not considering another convention here. He's just argued against why we don't want that. I made this point yesterday, but I want to reinforce it here. It's very clear that even though there are 2 strategies, 2 methods of ratifying the Constitution, Hamilton and the framers never believed that the Second Convention would ever be used. They believed that, as he says here, there's so much discord and disagreement among the states that you'd never get 2/3 anyway. So that one, forget it. Once you ratify the Constitution, the only logical way to amend it is to have amendments sent out from Congress to the states for ratification. He is assuming that only one way to amend the Constitution will be available. And of course, that's happened. That's the only way that amendments have ever been approved to the Constitution. The idea of a second convention has never been a reality until now. So I guess the question that's remaining is, if Hamilton never believed the convention method would ever be used, then why is it in there? He's going to tell us. It's in there to appease the states who are still suspicious and afraid of the Constitution. Madison says, in opposition to the probability of subsequent amendments, it has been urged that the persons delegated to the administration of the national government will always be disinclined to yield up any portion of the authority of which they were once possessed. What he's saying is the critics of the Constitution are arguing that once the Constitution is ratified, those people in the administration of the national government, the people with power, are never going to be willing to give it up. They're never going to be willing to acknowledge the need for change. Once we approve it, we're going to have to live with what we get. They'll never change it. Hamilton says, for my part, I acknowledge a thorough conviction that any amendments which may upon mature consideration be thought useful will be applicable to the organization of the government, not to the mass of its power, and on this account alone, I think there's no weight in the observation just stated. In other words, what he is doing is rejecting the idea that once the Constitution is established and the government's in place, they'll never let the system be amended. Hamilton is rejecting that. Because, he says, this is important, once it's underway, the amendments that will be applicable to the organization of the government, not to the mass of its powers. What we're seeing now in today's lobbying for a second convention is not a change in the organization of the government, but an organization in a change in the power of the government. What Hamilton says in Federalist 85 can never happen. These guys are trying to make happen now. This is revolution. This call for a second convention is revolution. Hamilton is saying in the very last Federalist paper that the security we have is that once the Constitution is ratified, any changes in it will be organizational changes. There won't be substantive changes relating to the powers of the government. Consequently, the only way of ratifying the Constitution that he's taking seriously is the one where the amendment passes 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then is sent out to the states for ratification. What these guys are doing now with the potential of call for a second convention is a revolution. It's never happened. Hamilton is saying right here it shouldn't happen. It can't happen. It won't happen. These people are trying to make it happen. But then he says something else. He says there's a further consideration, which proves beyond the possibility of a doubt that the observation is futile, the observation that once the government's in place, they won't accept amendments. It is that the national rulers, whenever now here's the call for a second convention. Here's the second method. Further consideration. It is that the national rulers, whenever 9 states concur, will have no option upon the subject. By the 5th article of the plan, here's the amendment, Article 5, by the 5th article of the plan, the Congress will be obliged on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, which at present amount to 9, to call a convention for proposing amendments, which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof. That's Article 5. So what he's saying is that provision for 2/3 of the states calling for a convention is in there as security to the people that there really is no danger to ratification of the Constitution. He says the words of this article are peremptory. The Congress shall call a convention. Nothing in this particular is left to the discretion of that body, of Congress. Congress can't stop it. Once 2/3 of the states call for a convention, Congress must call it. And then he concludes that paragraph with the sentence that George Will quoted that we read yesterday. We may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority. We are at the top of the hour, but let me summarize before we take our break, because I don't want to let this moment go. It is very clear that the reason there is a Second Amendment strategy put into Article 5, namely 2/3 of the states being able to call a convention to consider amendments, the reason it's in there is to assuage and reassure the people that their concern about the power of government is not anything that they need to worry about. The reason that's in there is so that they will feel safe in being able to amend the system if it needs to be amended. But Hamilton has made clear that he never expects that system to ever be used. No way can 2/3 of the states agree, as he points out. Rather, amendments will come from the top down to the states. There'll be no need to manage them or compromise on them. It'll be what they are. You either vote up or down. It'll be simple. That's the system for amendment that Hamilton is defending in this Federalist 85. Consequently, he ends this paper, the last sentence, and I read this yesterday. I dread the more consequences of new attempts because I know that powerful individuals in this and other states are enemies to a general national government in every possible shape. So again, the sentence that George Will used in his article to suggest that the founders would support a second constitutional convention called by the states is misplaced. When you look at it in the context that Hamilton wrote it, it becomes very clear that Hamilton's major concern about ratification of the Constitution is to keep down potential power of powerful individuals within the states by creating a stable national system that these people can never get control of. But now, through technology and this call for a second convention, we are facing the prospects of powerful individuals, wingnuts, who are out to change this system. And they're going to try to use the popularity of a balanced budget amendment to do it. I think on that note, we need a break. It's 4 minutes after the hour. Please stay with us here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I'm Bill O'Brien, and after a 5-minute break, we'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, and it's wonderful to hear that voice. Thank you so much. It's welcome, and so glad to hear that voice. I miss it. I miss it a lot. Thank you. Thank you, Agnes. Welcome back to the second hour of the Virtual Center on the study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. We welcome you to the program. If you are just joining us, welcome. If you've been with us through an hour with Federalist 85, then I can tell you, you are one of the few people in the country. How many people do you think, first of all, how many people do you think really have read all of 85 Federalist Papers? That's the first thing. And the second thing is, how many people have read them 1 to 2 to 3 to 4? How many people do you think ever read 85? It's really interesting, except that if you sat back and said, I wonder how this thing ends, so you might begin, it's like reading the last chapter of a mystery first in order to find out what happens or who done it or whatever. Kind of interesting in a way, because reading Hamilton, reading Federalist 85 is kind of a whodunit as well, isn't it? It kind of makes clear exactly who done it and why. Also, it makes clear who didn't do it and why. And so I think an awful lot of of grounding in the founding, if that's a very, it sounds like I'm playing with words here, and I'm not, that just came out. But a thorough grounding in the founding, as it were, it seems to me is called for. Because these guys are playing fast and loose with the evidence, with the facts, with the founders. They're trying to appropriate the founders. They're basically quoting them out of context. They're taking lines from speeches and papers they wrote and applying and putting them into totally new contexts in which they appear to say not only something different, but oftentimes the exact opposite of what they meant when they said it. So I think it's very important that we know the context of where this is happening. Once we understand what the Constitution was about, why it was written, what problems it was designed to solve, and they were real problems. Please don't, I don't want to give the suggestion here that in any way I think that the founders were elitists or arrogant necessarily. I really believed that they felt that everything that this republic promised was in jeopardy unless you basically resolve some of these issues and some of these problems. I really believe, and I don't know the answer because obviously it's happening right now, but I really believe that there's no way the founders could have anticipated the power and the importance of technology and what it was going to do in making the majority faction possible, in organizing and manipulating the political system in such a way that you can rely on the gullibility of the mass population, which goes back to the issues of education that we've been dealing with and will continue to deal with. And there's so much here that needs to be constantly out there. And I appreciate your willingness to join us for at least a portion of that. Invite you to call our number, area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. If you'd like to communicate directly with me, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, IEN 906, all one word, at gmail.com. At the end of the hour when we took our short break, I emailed the studio, and I said, "Where do you go after you call Wingnuts Wingnuts? Where do you go? Well, what's the next stage?" Well, believe me, there is a next stage, because I really think that there's some evidence here that'll give us a pretty good grounding in what we're really dealing with. Anyway, I mentioned George Will, and yesterday we spent some time with his April 9th article on the Goldwater Institute and its proposed amendment, balanced budget amendment, and that seems to be the strategy of the hour, so to speak. I'll be honest with you, one of the things in the back of my mind, by the time we finish the second hour, one of the things that bothers me about all of this is I'm really going to have to rethink George Will. Because when we go where I hope we're able to go this hour, I've always considered George Will to be one of the more intelligent conservatives in the nation. And the fact that he's falling for some of this stuff scares me. And I'm really conflicted about it. I mean that. I like George Will. And I think that you're going to see the depth and the sophistication of his thinking, of his analytical abilities. He's extremely bright and extremely capable. But what I'm finding as I'm doing research is that he's getting a lot of his information, he's taking it out of context, and he's piecing together a puzzle that fits his own agenda. And in the process, he's doing a massive disservice to the founders of this nation, to the Constitution of this nation. And I really do worry about it. On the 16th of April, in the Washington Post, George Will wrote an article which is in effect support for a new book by Timothy Sandefur. The title of the book is called The Conscience of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence and the Right to Liberty. I do not at this point, I just came across this in the last day or two. I do not yet, but I will read this book. It's called The Constitution of the Conscience of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence and the Right to Liberty. And this article that George Will writes on the 16th of April is an endorsement of that book because of what it says. And he's going to tell us what it says, and what it says is unbelievable. But let's look at this. We started to look at this yesterday. He says, George Will says, that in 2006, in an interview with Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, Breyer made the comment that the Constitution is basically about one word, democracy. We talked a little bit about this yesterday. That appears, the word democracy does not appear in either the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. It does not. Yet Breyer, according to George Will, believes that democracy is what the Constitution is all about, even though it doesn't mention it. Democracy is America's way of allocating political power, George Will says. I mentioned yesterday, I do not believe that that's true, unless you redefine democracy. Basically, the change that our political system and its evolution through the early years of the Republic has made in our electoral system, our political system, has effectively changed the meaning of democracy from that of power to that of participation. I ask you to think seriously about this, because I really believe that this is valid and this is important. And once you are clear on these distinctions, then that means that every time somebody throws out the word democracy, you've got to be very, very aware of what they're saying and what they're not saying. You've got to be very aware of which definition of democracy they are focusing on. When Madison talked in Federalist Number 10 about democracy, he was talking about the rule of the majority faction. He was talking about majority power. And Stephen Breyer is right. The whole Constitution was about making majority power impossible. So Breyer is absolutely 100% right. The whole story behind the Constitution was democracy, control of it, making sure that it didn't happen, making sure that the majority faction could not organize and could not, according to using Madison's terms, could not exert its power and influence. And so in that sense, that definition of democracy, George Will's right. Democracy is America's way of allocating political power. It was then. But the changes made, the transition from democracy as power, majority power, to democracy as participation, effectively eliminated power from the whole equation. It took power off the table. The difference between democracy as Madison used it and the democracy the way we used it today is that when we talk about something, a procedure being democratic, we're talking about everybody being able to participate in the process. We count up votes. It's majority vote. Granted, it's majority vote that wins the day. But it's a majority from a very diverse population. What makes the transition is the inability of what Madison called the majority faction to organize. And we know that that was the poor. It's one thing to allow the poor to participate in the overall decisions affecting the government. It's quite another to allow the poor to organize as a faction and participate as a faction. Let me give you an example. Some of you who remember your history from the 1920s will remember the name Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a black political leader who created an organization in the 1920s whose purpose was to organize all blacks throughout the world. His belief was that there was something in the neighborhood of 500 million African blacks living in the world. And he wanted to organize them into a faction. And his argument was that he didn't really hold a grudge against any other group, that all he wanted was to make sure that blacks received the same treatment and were treated the same as whites and browns and reds and all the rest of it. Marcus Garvey was seen as an incredible threat. Because our system is a majority rule system, it is susceptible to organized power. The key to understanding our political system is not majority rule per se. It's the nature of the majority. There's no problem allowing the poor, along with everybody else, to vote. Where the problem would come is if they vote primarily as poor. If they vote primarily in league with other poor people. If they organize. That means that our system is potential to the power that an organized majority would exert. Madison's whole strategy in the Constitution, through the checks and balances system, was to make sure that that kind of organized majority power could never organize. Consequently, our system of democracy is one which encourages mass participation because, according to the principles of consent of the governed, the very legitimacy of government's ability to govern is dependent on the consent of the government, which means it's directly dependent on the participation of the people being governed. People need to consent to be governed. Voting constitutes that consent. So the very nature of the meaning of the word democracy has changed from the way Madison used it to the way we used it today. When we talk about a decision and saying it really wasn't done democratically, what we mean is somebody was prevented from participating. It wasn't democratic because so-and-so couldn't participate. This group couldn't participate. That group couldn't participate. So our whole view of democracy has changed. The emphasis has changed from majority rule power to mass participation. It is very significant that George Will does not acknowledge that change. He is using the word democracy as Madison used it in the 18th century. And he is assigning that definition of democracy to progressives. He is basically arguing that when progressives support democracy, they are supporting majority rule power. That is absurd. It's disingenuous. It's dishonest. He knows better. The Constitution, George Will says, was adopted to continue to confine that power in order to secure the blessings of that which simultaneously justifies and limits democratic power, which is liberty. The difference is he calls it natural liberty. I would suggest to you that while the Constitution of the United States puts a premium on liberty, Madison says in Federalist number 10, when he's talking about how do you basically control the majority faction, one of the solutions that he dismisses is taking away liberty, taking away individual freedom. Madison says to take away freedom is a cure worse than the disease. So Madison's system puts a premium on individual freedom. But nowhere in the Constitution of the United States is that freedom labeled natural, inherent, or innate. The Constitution of the United States nowhere mentions the whole idea of natural rights. There's a lot of rights in the Constitution, within it as well as in the Bill of Rights. Freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, right to a jury trial, right to face your accuser, protection against ex post facto laws, which are laws passed making something illegal after when you did it, it was legal. You can't come and get you later. And if you watch Law and Order on television, as I do frequently, you probably know that. But the point is, these are civil rights. These are rights within our political framework, within our republic, because they are deemed conducive to the functioning and the operation of this republic. They are not natural rights. But George Will, in his very first paragraph of this article, claims that they are. Claims that liberty is a natural right. Calls it natural liberty. And then George Will goes on and explains the major differences between groups in our politics today. He says the fundamental division in U.S. politics is between those who take their bearings from the individual's right to a capacious, indeed indefinite, realm of freedom, and those whose fundamental value is the right of the majority to have its way in making rules about which specified liberties shall be respected. What he is saying is the major difference between progressives, between liberals and conservatives, is that conservatives put a premium on liberty, progressives put a premium on majority rule democracy. I would suggest to you that that is not true, given the discussion that we just had. Now, he says, there's a book, and here's where he mentions Timothy Sandefur's Conscience of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and the Right to Liberty. And he said the message of that book is this: the temperature of today's politics is commensurate to the stakes of today's argument. And then he goes into the argument. The argument is between conservatives who say U.S. politics is basically about a condition, liberty, and progressives who say it's about a process, democracy. Progressives who consider democracy the source of liberty reverse the founders' premise, which was liberty pre-exists governments, which, the Declaration says, are legitimate when instituted to secure natural rights. That sentence, that paragraph, is critically important. The difference between conservatives and liberals is conservatives put a premium on condition, which is liberty, progressives on a process, which is majority rule democracy. And he criticizes liberals because he's progressives, because he says in their support for democracy as the source of liberty, they are reversing the founders' premise, which was that liberty pre-exists governments. And the Declaration of Independence says that governments are legitimate because they are instituted to protect natural rights. Do you see how things are coming together here? I took the liberty before going on the air today of printing the paragraph, the relevant paragraph from the Declaration of Independence, because I think we need to basically know this, because this is what we're talking about. This is stuff that everybody knows. This is the second paragraph of the Declaration, the key philosophical one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. And then Jefferson goes on into the fact that you don't take power into your own hands for light and transient reasons. And then he makes all the charges against the king as to why the colonies have a right to be independent. So the key part is the philosophy at the beginning. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their power from the consent of the governed. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So governments are instituted among men to protect people's natural rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the phrase. That's the concept. What George Will does in this paragraph is to basically suggest, I need to find my place here, is to suggest that liberty pre-exists governments. Consequently, government was instituted to protect natural rights. That's true, according to the Declaration. But the Declaration is not the Constitution. The Declaration was the document written to justify colonial independence from Great Britain. But Jefferson does say that these truths are self-evident, and that all educated, thinking people will appreciate the fact that these things are true. And this is what the relation between government and its citizens ought to be. Let's go on, and we can bring all of this together, hopefully, in a moment. Back to progressives. This is George Will again. Progressives consider, for example, the rights to property and free speech as, in Sandefur's formation, spaces of privacy that government chooses to carve out and protect to the extent that these rights serve democracy. Conservatives believe that liberty, understood as a general absence of interference in individual rights, which cannot be exhaustively listed, are natural, and that governmental restrictions on them must be as few as possible and rigorously justified. Merely invoking the right of a majority to have its way is an insufficient justification. What we have here is an effort to suggest that liberty and property, because they are listed as natural rights in the Declaration of Independence, become priorities in the Constitution, even though they're not mentioned there. I think it's extremely important to recognize, for example, that George Will opens this article by taking issue with Breyer's argument that the Constitution is all about democracy when the word democracy is not mentioned in the Constitution. He's critical about the fact that democracy is not mentioned in the Constitution, even though Breyer is saying that's what it's all about. But now what he's suggesting is that the whole idea of liberty is a natural right and property are natural rights, and therefore must be protected by the Constitution, when in fact they are not mentioned in the Constitution either. So there seems to be an inconsistency there. But that's not really the point. The point is that what has to happen is that the Declaration of Independence must be put on an equal footing with the Constitution. Let me put it another way. The only way that you can justify the Constitution as being principally about protecting natural liberty, when it never mentions natural liberty, natural rights at all, is to alter the Declaration of Independence from a statement of principle into law. If you are able to assert that the Declaration of Independence, along with the Constitution, are both law, then the natural rights of the Declaration can slide easily into the Constitution of the United States, even though the founders didn't put them there. That's what these people are setting out to do. They are rewriting history. And they are manipulating the words in such a way that they're taking the appropriate phrases from the Declaration of Independence and linking them to the Constitution and suggesting that the limitations on the power of government are contained in the Declaration of Independence. Never did the framers at the Constitutional Convention believe for a moment that they were drafting a document whose principal purpose was to change the Declaration of Independence from a statement of principle to law. What that does effectively is change liberty into an absolute. If it's an unalienable right, if it's a natural right, that means that no government has the right, without serious justification, to interfere with individual liberty. Basically, what that suggests then is that the Constitution is a document which is rendered in secondary status to the Declaration of Independence. The statement of principle around which the nation is founded is the Declaration. The purpose of the Constitution is to make the Declaration into meaningful law. And here's the paragraph that does it from Sandefur. Sandefur, principal attorney at the Pacific Legal Foundation, notes that since the 1864 admission of Nevada to statehood, every state's admission into the Union has been conditioned on adoption of a constitution consistent with the U.S. Constitution and the Declaration. The Constitution is the nation's fundamental law, but is not the first law. The Declaration is. No way in God's world did Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Benjamin Franklin believe in the Constitution of the United States that they were writing the nation's first law. They were making a case to the world as to why the colonies should be independent. The Constitution is the nation's fundamental law, but is not the first law. The Declaration is, says George Will. Appearing on page 1 of Volume 1 of the U.S. Statutes at Large, and the Congress has placed it at the head of the United States Code under the caption, "The Organic Laws of the United States of America." Hence, the Declaration sets the framework for reading the Constitution, not as basically about democratic government, majorities, granting rights, but about natural rights defining the limits of even democratic government. Basically, then, what this position is about, what George Will is saying, and he's obviously endorsing the position of Timothy Sandefur in this book, is that the first law of the United States is the Declaration of Independence, and that the Constitution is written in order, principally, to protect the natural rights more than implementing democratic government. This is unbelievable. But I would suggest to you that's what this argument by George Will on the 16th of April in the Washington Post is about. George Will goes on. The perennial conflict in American politics, Sandefur says, concerns which takes precedence, the individual's right to freedom or the power of the majority to govern. The purpose of the post-Civil War's 14th Amendment protection of Americans' privileges and immunities was to assert on behalf of emancipated blacks national rights of citizens. National citizenship grounded on natural rights would thwart Southern states then asserting their power to acknowledge only such rights as they chose. So now they've incorporated the 14th Amendment into this, the privileges and immunities of emancipated slaves into citizens. Government, the framers said, is instituted to improve upon the state of nature in which the individual is at the mercy of the strong. But when democracy, meaning the process of majority rule, is the supreme value, when it is elevated to the status of what the Constitution is basically about, the individual is again at the mercy of the strong, the strength of mere numbers. Again, not the meaning of democracy in today's world. Sandefur says progressivism inverts America's constitutional foundations by holding that the Constitution is about democracy, which rejects the framers' premise that majority rule is legitimate only within the boundaries of the individual's natural rights. These include, indeed are mostly, unenumerated rights whose existence and importance are affirmed by the 9th Amendment. The Ninth Amendment says, to the Bill of Rights, says that the mention of the rights in the previous 8 amendments does not mean that there won't be more rights. And the one we debate all the time today is the right of privacy, which is not mentioned in the Constitution. But many people think in terms of technological advance, we're going to have to do something in order to make sure that privacy is protected as a right. But not a natural right. Not a right that's superior to government. If you read this paragraph about the Ninth Amendment, it talks about unenumerated rights whose existence and importance are affirmed by the Ninth Amendment. In other words, what he is saying is that every right, even the ones we haven't articulated yet, are natural rights. They have moved the Declaration of Independence very shrewdly into the constitutional framework to the point that Jefferson's unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property become any right that at any time individuals are seen to need. And once they are there, they are natural rights, which means government can't interfere with them, which means that in this society, it is the individual who has all the power. There is no society. There is no community. There is no rule of law. There are merely individuals with a whole bunch of rights, all of them natural, all of them absolute, all of them above and beyond the ability of government to interfere with. Effectively, in this frame of reference, there is no government, there is no community, there is no constitutional order. I would suggest to you that this is more than bizarre. This is revolutionary. We have about 10 minutes left, actually closer to 15 in our program. Let me share with you an article written by Ronald Cherry entitled Declaration of Independence as Law. This appeared in an internet publication called The American Thinker. American Thinker is a right-wing organization that publishes a lot of articles. One of the articles, for example, mentioned is an article by somebody named Clayman. You may remember Clayman was involved with Sarah Palin and the others in the protest on Washington not too long ago. I think what you're going to see in this is a lot of what we just saw in George Will's article. And that's kind of what scares me. If I can, let me share this with you. Our American Declaration of Independence is the supreme, unamendable moral law of the United States. Declarational law preceded and trumps our supreme amendable secular law, the Constitution. As stated in our Declaration, the purpose of secular law, the Constitution, is to secure our sacred, unalienable, equal individual rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, i.e., private property honestly earned through creative labor. That to secure these rights, governments' constitutions are instituted among men. That's the first sentence in this article. Our Declaration of Independence is the supreme, unamendable moral law of the United States. Declarational law preceded and trumps our supreme amendable secular law, the Constitution. As bizarre as this sounds, this has to be in order for this whole argument to hold up, to make any sense. The purpose of the Constitution is to secure our sacred, unalienable, equal individual rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The Constitution merely creates the agent to enforce and uphold the rights of freedom articulated in the Declaration of Independence and the rights to own property. Next paragraph. While our Constitution and Bill of Rights are the greatest secular laws ever written, it must be acknowledged that our secular Constitution has a sacred mandate, the Declaration of Independence. A sacred mandate. Jefferson. If we were to look in his grave right now, he's stirring. The American Revolution is, first and foremost, a revolution in sacred, unalienable human rights and their associated moral laws, Declaration, and secondarily, a revolution in secular law, the Constitution. We must be aware that secular law, and particularly the living Constitution, Orwellian newspeak for dead Constitution, can be perverted into tyranny when such law becomes destructive of the individual's human rights. I think you're beginning to see where much of this comes from. Forced equality, well, let me go back. All men are created equal is American declarational law. Men, in this instance, refers to all individuals, and the word equal refers to natural equal rights and equal application of just law, not unnatural, forced equal social and economic outcome. So again, what they've done is they've pretty well taken care of the idea of equality. Equality means equal natural rights and equal application of just law. Equality does not mean equality of outcome. The challenge to progressives. Forced equality of outcome represents social engineering empowered by the injustice of unequal rights and inequality before the law. This leads to excessive collectivization of some people's labored-for property, which is sent into the communal hands of a self-serving government that redistributes this property to the less industrious in return for votes. All individuals are endowed with equal unalienable rights to life, liberty, and labored-for property, and to equality before law that must secure those rights. All men and women made equal in value and rights by the Creator and the great equalizer. What is done is pull it all together. He has shifted the Declaration of Independence from a statement of principle, from an historical artifact, to a statement of sacred law. He has reduced the Constitution of the United States to secondary status. It is secular law, clearly inferior to sacred law, which is the Declaration. He has taken the word equality in the Declaration of Independence and reduced it to the idea of equal natural rights and equal application of just law, not into an idea of the entire society working to create a much equal and fairer and more democratic quality of life for all the people in our society. Those people that put the emphasis on equality of outcome are in effect supporting social engineering empowered by the injustice of unequal rights and inequality before the law. If each individual is made in the image of God, then his or her value is infinite. All individuals are thereby equal in value before God, and equal in their unalienable rights and equal before the law. All, therefore, should be taxed equally. If man is not made in the image of God, then some will become, as an animal farm, more equal than others. Legal superiority based on unequal rights and unequal law. There's a couple of more lines in this article I want to get to before we sum up our program today. He goes back to Jefferson's Declaration. That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, is American declarational law. If man is made in the image of God, then since God lives and gave life to man, all individuals have sacred, unalienable rights to life and self-defense. Next, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are liberty, is American declarational law. If man is made in the image of God, since God is free, then man has a sacred, unalienable right to liberty. Man is born free. Human freedom can occur when all men are equal before just law, and freedom is a prerequisite to the individual's creative pursuit of happiness. If man is made in the image of God, then man is equal to God in terms of his freedom. If you put all of this together, I would suggest to you that there's no possibility that government would have any power to govern at all. Talk about manipulating the past in order to justify an agenda in the present. As I mentioned at the top of this hour, when I read this from the Thinker, I shiver at the thought that George Will is brought into this stuff. Over the years, I've looked to people like him to show us the way to see through this stuff. Not to become a convert. I am very, very concerned about that particular aspect. But I am more concerned about the fact that 34 states have requested a constitutional convention. And the people driving this movement and raising the dollars, the huge number of dollars necessary to pull this off, are people who believe this kind of stuff. And they want an opportunity to sit around a table and make changes in the Constitution of the United States. But, hey, it's secondary law anyway. It's only man-made law. The Declaration is sacred law. Thomas Jefferson. I'm not going to go into Jefferson's whole approach about God as being, Jesus as being the Son of God and all of that. I'm not going to go into all of that at this point. But I would suggest to you that there's no way in the world that Jefferson believed when he put these words down on paper that he was writing sacred law. And then bringing it in and holding it up before the Continental Congress and letting them make 85 changes in it. If it's sacred law, how do you have 85 amendments to the first draft? Because Jefferson's first draft of the Declaration is there. And in the final draft, if you count them, there are 85 changes from Jefferson's original draft to the final product. So these delegates from the different states are sitting there amending God's law? I trust that my cynicism here is well placed. I'm not making light of this. On the contrary, I'm trying to point out how dangerous it really is. These people should not be allowed out after dark, let alone amending the Constitution of the United States. I think all of us need to be very, very careful. I've read this at least 5 times today. I'm going to read it one more time. If man is made in the image of God, since God is free, then man has a sacred and unalienable right to liberty. Man is born free. Can you believe the assumption that man's freedom and God's freedom are put on the same plane? Not only did they take the Declaration of Independence and put it on the same plane with the Constitution, now they are taking man and putting him on the same plane with God. All for an ulterior motive, all for a purpose, all for an agenda, which is to emasculate the power of the federal government to govern. And turn power over to the money brokers, to the big money in this country. And as we've seen and we will continue to see in future programs, the Supreme Court of the United States is leading the way and showing them how to do it. I think all of us need to be very, very aware of what's going on. It is the top of the hour. It's 5 p.m. in the East. We will be back tomorrow at our regular time, which is 4 to 6 in the East. This is Bill O'Brien for the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Thank you so very much for listening. I appreciate your time. Have a wonderful evening. Be safe. We hope that you'll be back tomorrow. Thank you.